Halito, welcome to the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma's Historic Preservation Choctaw Shoshone Virtual Speaker Series. Saho Chifoet Megan Baker. I'm a research associate at Choctaw Nation, and I'll be your host for the next hour. For those of you who are new to our series, Choctaw Shoshone is a person who helps us understand the history and knowledge of our Choctaw ancestors. And the purpose of this series is to feature and share the knowledge that our Choctaw community members, artists, cultural bearers, scholars of Choctaw culture and history, and other experts, and to share what they've kind of learned. So today we have Choctaw community member and renowned author of numerous historical fiction novels, Sarah Elisabeth Sawyer. In 2012, her work on the Trail of Tears was recognized by the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, which accepted her into their Artist Leadership Program. She has authored books including A Noble Warrior, the Choctaw Tribune series, and edited a collection of Trail of Tears stories titled Touch My Tears, Tales from the Trail of Tears. To start today's conversation, Sarah is going to provide a brief overview of her books and the topics and the time periods that they cover. Then we'll switch to a question and answer format to learn a little bit more about her research process and her experiences as a Choctaw literary artist. Hopefully no one will think that there's too many spoilers because I'm going to, because in preparation for today, I had read Sarah's A Noble Warrior. So we're going to be discussing it a little bit, but we kind of all know what happened in World War I and with the Choctaw, so it should be okay. All right, go ahead and take it away, Sarah.
Well, Halito, Megan, thank you for having me. This is an honor to speaker series, and I just think of all the things that the Historic Preservation Department has, the roles that you guys have played in the books, and Dr. Ian Thompson, Ryan Spring, Deanna Bird, just everyone there has been so helpful and so courteous as I've gone through this journey with my books, and I really appreciate it. I live in Texas. My papa was born in Meade, Oklahoma, near where his father's original allotment was. His father was an original Dawes enrollee, William Odell, and my papa, William Odell. His ancestry goes back to, we've been able to trace back our ancestry to the Trail of Tears, and my fifth generation grandfather, William Roebuck, who buried his father on the trail. And that was one of the big inspirations for the stories and the work that I do. And that's what led to the first book, Touch My Tears, Tales from the Trail of Tears, the collection that I edited through my project with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. That was the first book that got us kicked off. And then I started on the Choctaw Tribune series, book one, The Executions. We released it. Then I switched back to Toshpa's story, which is an expanded version, a full book version of the short story that I did for Touch My Tears. And Toshpa was an actual young man who crossed, he was a boy really, whenever he crossed on the Trail of Tears. And I really wanted to expand his story into an entire novella length book. So I did that, went back to the Choctaw Tribune series and put out Traders, which is book two. Then I put that series on hold to do A Noble Warrior, which I know we're going to get into talking about here in a bit. That was an enormous project. Spent about 2 years researching the Choctaw code talkers, got to travel to France and visit the battle sites there where they actually fought and did their code talking. And after that, I got back to book three in the Choctaw Tribune series, Shaft of Truth, released that in April, which thank you again, Megan, for your help on that book. That was involving the coal mining industry, kind of 1890s, pre-statehood Oklahoma and Choctaw Nation before statehood and Indian Territory. We released that book in April, and that brings us to about where we are now.
Awesome. It was so great to be able to read it in the manuscript form. And it was really interesting because it's a period of Choctaw history that no one really kind of writes about and that we don't know much about. So it was really great for you to kind of explore that. And I really enjoyed it. So we'll just kind of, she's told us a little about that. And so we're going to end the questions. So Sarah has such an interesting kind of story behind how she comes to a writer. And I think one of the really interesting ways is her kind of experience with homeschooling. So, and I think about that in the context of our Choctaw ancestors who also knew that formal schooling is not the only way that we like gain knowledge and get an education. Um, so I was wondering, could you perhaps kind of tell us a bit about your journey in homeschooling and what was it kind of like, and how was it able to maybe incorporate different kinds of things that you wouldn't learn in a school per se?
Yeah, absolutely. A huge credit to my parents for the sacrifices they made to homeschool. We were single income family, and just that experience allowed me to get my education at my pace and complete, a full education, but also explore the things that really interested me, which was largely writing. I wrote my first story when I was 5, and my mom thankfully saved it. My brother, who's one of my brothers, who's 2 years older than me, he had illustrated it, and that was the beginnings of that. And I really got to explore my interest in reading and writing. I spent a decade in 4-H, which was phenomenal. I did record books, which I think about my very last record book whenever I was 19, and they pushed me out of 4-H, said I was too old now, and I had to exit the program. But my last record book, at the end of that story that I wrote, kind of concluding my year, is my dream was to be a professional writer, and how awesome that would be. So homeschooling really gave us that flexibility to explore specifically our different interests, and I chose to continue that on through higher education and do self-directed education into my writing career and entrepreneurship, and just exploring all of those things that interested me. I hit a point whenever I was 23 years old where I had a lot of things going and all at the same time, and we had a lot of family issues and health crisis that we were dealing with. And I just felt like everything in my life was just strewn on this giant whiteboard, and it was all the things that I wanted to do, all the things I was doing, all the things I felt everyone wanted me to do and expected me to do. And I just reached that point of full surrender where I was like, I have to just stop. I was more forced to. I had a mini meltdown and just kind of crashed for about 3 days. And during that time, I came to that point of surrender, and I began wiping those things off the board. And I came to writing, and I stopped, because we talk about surrender and surrendering everything. But I knew at that point what I was committing to was everything I wiped off. Whatever God didn't put back on that board, I was leaving out of my life. And when I came to writing, I thought, what if He doesn't put that back on there? And so I took a deep breath and wiped that off the board. And nothing happened for about 7 months, except that I experienced a tremendous amount of peace and rest. And at the end of that period is when God brought writing back into my life, and I knew that was my purpose, and that was going to be my journey in life.
Wow, intense. But I'm glad you came back to being a writer, because I've learned kind of so much from your writing.
Thank you.
So histories about American Indians are rarely written by American Indians, and this is a major theme in Anumpa Warrior, actually, even. Um, so given that, I was wondering a bit, why is it that you write historical fiction rather kind of history itself? What is it about fiction that it lets you do that maybe writing a straightforward archival history might not do for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we do look at, writing about our history and writing it from an Indigenous and specifically a Choctaw perspective is so critical. The reason I chose fiction is, one, I grew up on historical fiction, absolutely loved it. It was my favorite genre. And I remember I reached an age where I found out that historical fiction wasn't necessarily actual history, and it wasn't accurate. And I was just so disappointed, because I was like, I thought I was learning real history. That stuck with me. So whenever I chose to do historical fiction, I made a commitment that I wanted it to be heavy on the history, and heavy on the fiction, but I wanted it to be as accurate as possible. And one of the first things that I did early on, whenever I started this writing journey, is my mom and I went to the Five Tribe Story Conference up in Muskogee. Phenomenal experience. Really got to spend time, just days, with very seasoned Native writers from all over the country. Joseph Rashak, uh, Leanne Howe, just Rilla Askew, who actually endorsed the executions, which I was very honored by. Just spending that time with them, and a lot of them, or pretty much all of them, wrote fiction. And I think their philosophy, and I know my philosophy behind it, is that we gain most of our education in that, especially cultural education, I think through entertainment. So we have, whenever you think about, especially American society and even European, how they learned about American Indians is through television and movies and novels, children's stories. That's how most people have the stereotypes and how they gain their education about American Indians. So my thought was to take that same route, but educate them on the true history and culture of our people, and to educate and influence through entertainment. I know Dr. Philip Morgan, who was there at the Five Tribes Conference, and talking about he did a lot of more professor literary work and historical history book kind of work. And one of the things he said is that he was switching over to start writing novels because he felt he could reach a larger audience. And that just continued to confirm that path that I was on, of reaching a mainstream audience that wouldn't necessarily pick up a history book that's just full of facts and figures and maybe some photos about these people that lived long ago, but to draw people in and put them in these characters' place, put them in their shoes so they can experience life through their eyes, and hopefully influence them and teach them our true history and culture.
Yeah, that's so important to kind of like put people in an emotional kind of state and like inhabit the same kind of space. And it definitely is super important to reach people that way, because it's so easy to like open a history book and be like, I'm bored, and close the book, and that's it.
Yeah, and I'll add this, Megan, with these stories, is preservation is a part of that. We want to preserve the history. And I think about Touch My Tears, we've had 3 of the 10 authors who have passed since we did that book. And a lot of the stories that they wrote were based on their family stories, and they were the last ones who had that. So being able to even preserve those, kind of that last generation, a lot of the elders that I get to interview, and put those in writing, and that's going to continue on, hopefully even past my lifetime.
Yeah, and that also kind of helps us to understand oral histories are super important, and Choctaw people, we've always kind of told them, and that's how we passed along knowledge and lessons, moral philosophy, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, super important. So in one story in particular that I would be interested in is like, how did you learn about Choctaw code talkers? Can you tell people who might not know, who are watching, just a little bit about them? And yeah.
Absolutely. So as I said, I grew up in Texas, but we were always very connected to Oklahoma, and we would go to the Labor Day and the Trail of Tears commemorative walk, and those were all very meaningful things as I was growing up. And then as I did them as adulthood, I just had a really different perspective on it. But those are things I was always exposed to. And I can't remember a time when I didn't know about the Choctaw Code Talkers. It wasn't like an epiphany, like, oh, look at these. I even remember when Wind Talkers came out and everybody's talking about the Navajo Code Talkers, and I was like, yeah, with the Choctaw Code Talkers, and that was a long time ago now when that came out. But that was always I'd always wanted to write about that, and like the Irish potato famine gift, I knew about that, Trail of Tears. So the Code Talkers, I actually wrote a flash fiction about them, I think about 9 years ago. And so that had always been on my mind and my heart to dig into that history, because everybody I spoke with, like for me, it was just common knowledge. It's like I'd grown up knowing it, but no one that I spoke to knew that story or knew anything about the Code Talkers. So for anyone who is watching this who's not familiar with the Choctaw Code Talkers, they were the original Code Talkers in World War I. Again, most people know of the the World War II Navajo Code Talkers, which was a much larger program, and it was actually structured and all of that, whereas the Choctaws were more used on the field in the heat of battle when they needed them to transmit messages over the telephone. It wasn't even radio, it was telephone and telephone lines, which was very easy for the Germans to tap into, and all their messages were being intercepted, all the American messages, all of their conversations, everything was being intercepted. And when they used the Choctaws at the Battle of Forest Farm, that's when things changed. And again, spoiler alert, we used the code talkers. America won the war, but they played that part. And I like to think, based on my research and a few new pieces that I dug out, that it even kind of laid some of the groundwork for the World War II program, and even the confidence in the American military to use American Indians and their language for the Second World War. So that's a little bit about those. Did I cover all of that question?
Yeah, and I had another question, because in the book you use the term, the book is obviously titled Unknown Warrior, and the book, it's something that you refer to, it's something that they call themselves. But was that actually how they refer to themselves?
So that is actually a term that I coined. And from a marketing perspective, I was hesitant to use an unknown word. Like, even when I do interviews with non-natives or non-Choctaws, they're kind of unsure about how to pronounce it, and they're concerned about pronouncing it incorrectly. And, I pronounce it for them. But it was really important for me to have a Choctaw word in the title. I was like, this is about the Choctaw language. That's what this book is about. And I felt using Anumpa, at the Choctaw word for language words, that was just really appropriate to think of them as language warriors. They were warriors in the sense of being on the battlefield, but they used every tool that they had, and their language was one of them. And so I had a lot of great suggestions for titles. One really great author friend of mine, who was just a driving force for this book, she had suggested Trench Talkers, which I thought was a great title. But ultimately, I settled on using a Choctaw word, and Anumpa Warriors seemed very appropriate. So I coined that and inserted that with a couple of the characters that it was really appropriate for, and just kind of contributing that to their legacy.
Sounds good. It works out, because it's like, it's nice to kind of have as you're reading the book, being like, oh, learning all the kind of words, and like once you use them in context, you remember them a lot better than when you're just trying to memorize a list of Choctaw words.
Right. And quick shout out to the language department. Really appreciate their help in making sure we got those as accurate as we could, and even translating an actual message that the Choctaws used while they were over there, that I found in the National Archives, and translating that, and we exciting. Really appreciate the Choctaw Nation School of Language.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's really nice to see us, Choctaw Nation, be able to kind of collaborate with artists in this way to promote art culture. And so you also have a blog in which you kind of take us on your writing journey with you. And so this is one of the things you talk about on the blog, but I would love for you to kind of say a little bit more. But you took a research trip to France. How did that kind of come about? What did you learn about? Why did you feel like you had to kind of go for the book? And what are some of the things maybe you couldn't have learned if you hadn't been there?
Excellent. There, I connected with, it was at one of the Choctaw gatherings where I was doing a book signing, connected with the cousin of Tijuana Kokenauer, who is the sister of Paul King. A lot of Choctaws are familiar with his artwork. She's an artist as well. She was going over to France to do a presentation at an international conference on the Code Talkers. Well, the conference wasn't on the Code Talkers. It was a speakers conference, and she was doing a presentation on the Choctaw Code Talkers. And we got on the phone and we're trading research notes. And I was like, oh, that would just be so amazing to actually go to France, go to the battlefields, which had been in the back of my mind. But I was like, oh, that's not going to happen. I got too many things up in the air personally and all. And so as we were talking, she was like, oh, well, you should come with me. And I was like, oh, I wish. And it just kept percolating in the back of my mind. And one of my other brothers, Doug, he really encouraged me to do it, just go for it. And so I did. One of the big reasons why I wanted to go is up till that point, all of the books that I had written, the stories I'd written, I'd actually been to those places. Mississippi, up Friars Point, where Toshpa and his family crossed. We found like almost the exact crossing where they were at, and the river there at Friars Point. Of course, all the places in Oklahoma, what was Indian Territory. And one of the compliments that I get on my writing is people that I feel really honored is people who grew up in Oklahoma saying, oh, this is just like what it was whenever I was growing up here, and they're 60, 70, 80 years old. And so I knew it was important, if I could at all possible, go to the actual places where they fought. So I packed up my bags and ended up over in France with Tiana about a month after we first talked about it. We spent, I think it was 10 days there. After her conference period, we went out into the countryside. We connected with a local guide there who was he was just amazing. Roger, who took us around, didn't charge us a dime. I told him I would buy his gas, and he just looked at me, and I was like, petrol. I'll get you petrol. And so he took us around for 3 days. We were able to find Forest Farm, still in existence today. I don't think we would have made it there without Roger. So we actually got to go up on the farm. That's where the Choctaws did their code talking. And then we were able to drive up on this overlook at Vonk and actually look down at the battlefield. And at that point, that's when it was so critical that I actually got to go there, because I had a sketch of the battlefield. But when we were up there and Roger was looking at it, who's a World War I historian, and he was like, I see how this would have been so difficult for them to take this salient, because where we were standing at, that's where the German artillery was. In the valley right below that is where the machine gunners were, the German machine gunners, and then there was a river, and then the Americans and French were on the other side. And he said, if they came straight across the river, the machine gunners would get them. If they tried to come up around the hill like what we drove, the machine gunners would get them, and if they tried to come straight on, the artillery would get them. So he was like, it was just almost impossible to take that area, and the French had actually tried twice and failed. So it was just, for me, just added that magnitude of how important it was for the Choctaws to use their language in setting up that battle, and took the Germans completely by surprise, saved a lot of lives really on both sides, being able for them to be able to take that salient. The other thing that really, well, there were several things, but one other thing that really struck me was when we actually got to travel the road leading up to those battle sites. So the actual road that they transported down by truck and by marching, and one of them was a Roman road, or what Roger said would be a Roman road, because it went straight ahead over and up and down the hills as opposed to going around. And he said this would have been a Roman built road. And so that influenced the line in the book of, they were going straight into battle, not going left or right, but just straight in to St. Etienne, which was their first battle. The last tremendous highlight that I'll just point out right quick is getting to see Otis Leader's painting. He was selected by a French artist who was commissioned by the French government to paint the different soldiers of the different nationalities there. So when the Americans landed, he went to the 4th of July parade 1917, and he spotted Otis Leader and said, who better to represent the American doughboy than an American Indian? And so he selected him. He became known as the ideal American doughboy, and he lived up to his name on that. I could talk all day about Otis Leader. But so that was a tremendous privilege. We got permission from the museum to bring a digital copy back, and Tijuana, we replicated it to where it looks like a painting, with the same size and dimensions and framing that they have of the original one, and we're able to donate it to the Choctaw Nation, and it's up at the museum in Tushkahoma for anyone who would like to see that.
So amazing. And it's like, whoa, didn't think that actually kind of happened, because there's like so much in the book, but that one is like a really kind of cool one to the fact that you, like, no one had kind of really seen it, and Choctaw Nation didn't have it, and you're like, oh, I went to France and I brought back this painting that no one knew existed.
It was amazing. It's a privilege, true privilege to be able to do that.
So cool. Yeah. So one of the kind of really unexpected details in the book was you mentioned that there was German propaganda about American Indian soldiers that circulated Europe about them being kind of like savages and you gotta like watch out for them. And I was like, this is so crazy. Could you share a little bit more about that and why you included it in the book? And what are the sources that kind of talk about this?
Mhm. Yeah, that caught me off guard, and even to see the American soldiers kind of play that up, and the officers play that fear up that the Germans had of American Indians. So a lot of my sources, old newspapers, which are horribly unreliable, as you know, they're not terribly accurate, but it does kind
Yeah.
of give a little bit of that feel of kind of some of the thoughts and emotions that were going on there. And so I got to read articles that told about how the American officers would try to really play up that they had Indian soldiers with them, these fierce warriors and fighters and protectors. One of the books, and I think it'll probably be backwards, but American Indians in World War One by Thomas Britton. That was an excellent source, and in the back of it is just pages and pages of his sources that he drew that from. And I want to say that's specifically where I read about the German propaganda, and I just kind of latched onto that because I was like, that's really fascinating that you think about 1917, 1918, well past the major Indian wars and all of those things, and especially when you think about like the trial, to think that the German soldiers would have that. And I believe there was actually a German author who wrote a book kind of about the noble Indian and
Mm-hmm.
put in there, their fighting abilities and all of these things that really served to frighten the German soldiers. So the American officers really played that up. And I think, the American Indians, and I think even in World War II, they did this where they played on that. There's the photo of the warriors who are going into battle and actually painting on war paint in World War II. So they definitely took that warrior spirit and a lot of their fighting traditions into these world wars and onto foreign soil. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. One of the things I really like about your work is the way that you've really made it like a kind of a family project. Can you tell, because your mom is so kind of really involved in your work, and it's really like kind of nice to see it as this kind of like intergenerational project. So can you tell us a little bit more about working with your mom on these books, and how has that kind of shaped your trajectory as a writer?
Mm-hmm. She's my best friend. If you can't tell, she's been taking care of me even in this process. It's rare. It's a rare sighting if you see one of us without the other. We, in fact, whenever we do book events and signings and stuff, she's the one at the front of the table sharing my books and everything. Because I am more of an introvert. I do love like setting up at Labor Day and different events and visiting with the people that I know. But she definitely takes the forefront on a lot of that. She's my first editor. She's the one who reads all of my stuff before it goes out, and especially the books, and making sure that they're spiritually and culturally accurate. Those are things that she really hones in on, and she'll bring out a lot of stuff that I'll just miss. And she's like, well, we talked about this, and why, you think you should portray it that way and put it in there like that. And so we'll work through a lot of issues. We've worked through a lot of issues on every one of these books, and sometimes making hard decisions in how to portray certain things that are just really sensitive or hard history that we're dealing with. So I really rely on her wisdom and her prayers to get me through each project. And like I said, we do all of our shows together. She's an artist as well, so she does photography, some filmmaking, and beaded jewelry based on our culture that she just started with some of our ancestor stories, and really admire all the work that she does and that she's still helping, willing to put in there with me. And even the NMAI grant you mentioned in my bio at the beginning with the National Museum of the American Indian, she's the one who found that. And so as far as my trajectory as a writer, that's what really launched me into the Native world as a legitimate Native author. And so that's had a tremendous impact on, she has a tremendous impact on everything that I do. And like I said, it is multi-generational. Also on my family, as far as a family affair. Family's cheap, or most time free, and so so for two of my books, the first book in the background there, Touch My Tears, is actually my brother on the cover, one of my brothers who's closest to me in age, and it was hard to get him to sit still through the 500 shots. She did the photography on that, but we finally got the right shot for the graphic designer. And then on A Numpa Warrior, that's my brother, on that cover, we were able to get yes, that one, very familiar cover now. We were able to get actual World War One gear. That's an actual World War One doughboy uniform and 1917 American field phone. So exactly what the Choctaw doughboys would have had. And it was important to me to have a Choctaw on the cover if we were going to have someone on the cover. And my other brother my brother Doug does a ton of research. That's Johnny. And my brother Doug does a lot of research. And my other brother, one of my other brothers, I have five. One of my other brothers, James, he is an avid reader. So we get on the phone and talk through the stories quite a bit. And I really appreciate all of their support, all of my brothers supporting my work. So yeah, it's a family affair.
Oh, that's so nice. So what are other ways that you kind of collaborated with other kinds of people for all of the different kinds of projects have you done? Or is there like education things, or like what have you kind of, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I've done, like I said, I've done a few things, gotten the books in some of the, some schools, and I had looked at maybe collaborating some with Jones Academy, getting the books in there. And I still want to do that. And as far as like, you know, there's so many wonderful projects. And I just have to kind of keep honed in on that. I did appreciate from A Numpa Warrior, one of the things that I got to do with the French student who did her master's thesis. I didn't get to meet her in person, but I got to meet her professor, who is a professor in France, but he married an Oklahoma girl. And so they come back. Yeah, they come back every so often. And they came, I believe it was the end of 2018, so not or beginning of 2019, right there, not long after the book released. And we were able to make an appointment with Chief Batten and present a copy of her master's thesis from the professor to Chief. And that was a really cool moment and thing to be able to do. And I hope more things come out, more collaborations and education for especially schools will come about. I do write all of my books, and I did that intentionally with A Numpa Warrior. I write them where they're for all ages. So they, I do tell people with this, it is war. So when you're looking at having them for your kids, just be aware that there is some violence. No, I wouldn't say anything that goes beyond, PG-13. But I do that. I got that from Mary Lou Awiakta, who was in the first book, Touch My Tears. And she's Cherokee, but she had written a Choctaw Trail of Tears story with a Choctaw illustrator. And one of the things she told me is she doesn't really like the ages that people put on literature a lot of times, that she believes Native stories should be told the same for 8-year-old to 80-year-old, all ages that are stories should be told and told over and over. So she was often categorized in the children's book category. And she said, well, it's not a children's story. It's a story for all people, all ages. And so I've kind of taken that a little bit in my approach with the books so that, they are acceptable for kids and schools. And I have people say, oh, I'm reading this with my 10-year-old granddaughter. And so I wanted even extending the family aspect of it with these books. So I hope that continues.
That sounds great. I know before you mentioned that you had that fellowship, which was really kind of great. And so that seemed to have gotten you connected to the wider Native writer community. So could you tell us maybe a little bit more about that kind of experience? And do you have any advice for probably maybe some writers out there and how to get involved in being a Native writer? I think it's also a really great time for Native writing because now there's so many more books. And so what's it like to be a part of that also, I guess?
Such a big question. No, that's good. Could you repeat the first part of your question? Let me
just like how is your experience with like a wider Native writer community kind of been like?
Gotcha. So going back to the Five Tribes Story Conference, I think we had that for Greg Rogers and Mary at the Five Tribes Story Conference would head that up. I think they did it through a grant. And through that, I got to meet all these, like me, I was just a baby by comparison when we first started going to that. And I get to meet authors like Joseph Brashack, who's done well over, I think, 100 books, native books, and uh, Leanne Howe, and just so many, Dr. Philip Morgan. And Tim and Greg really kind of took me under their wing at that time, and I continue to appreciate that. And I've always considered them mentors, especially in those early years. And we really miss Greg. Greg Rogers, he passed about 5 or 6 years ago now, and was very, very sweet, kind soul. He'd even talked about us maybe co-writing a novel sometime. But that's where I really got into the Native community, and that was my first experience of just being around Native authors. And so we made that commitment every year to go to that. The last one that they had was in 2012, and that was actually my first storytelling um, venture. I thought I was going to get into oral storytelling more, but I've found through my career and through the years to really lean toward writing. And I'll leave the very talented Tim Tingle for the oral storytelling. He captivates. And I heard a lot of storytellers through that, and I just never saw anyone captivate a room like Tim can. Um, so that was a great experience. That was the first time I did. Tim and Greg invited me to do storytelling, and we'd set it up several months before. In August of that year, late August, August 26th, actually, my dad passed, and that just split time in two for me. It split my life in two. 2 days after that is when I got the call from the NMAI that I'd been accepted into the artist leadership program. So it literally was the best of times and the worst of times. So I was planning for that fellowship and adjusting with my dad, because my mom and I were his caretakers throughout his multiple health conditions. So that was a month later. I was at the Five Tribes Conference and just being loved on by everyone there, and very it was really a gift to do that before I then went to DC for my 2-week fellowship with the NMAI. And that was a great experience, going and seeing some of the things in the Native archives that we don't get to see very often. We got an appointment to view the original treaties, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, and all in the National Archives. So it's just a really tremendous experience on that. So that kind of set me up. I think at that point, and then when I started in on my project, which was the Touch My Tears book, was a part of that fellowship. So when I started on that project, did the workshop, had all these Choctaw authors submit their stories, that's when the weight of the responsibility of what I was doing really settled in. And I was like, these authors, one, as artists, as authors, they're working hard. They're really dedicated and committing to doing the very best they can on these stories, and I want to honor that. And then after being in DC and all of our experience with our actual history and culture, I was really experiencing the weight of that, and really wanted to nurture other authors as much as I could and pass on what I had learned and what I had been given. So on that, as far as advice was that one of your questions about advice for up and coming writers? Okay, so on that, I would say, one, be patient with yourself. So kind of coming back to that weight of responsibility, and also just looking at other writers who may be faster writers or more successful, again, always guarding against that comparison trap. But just be patient with yourself. You're likely going to have more setbacks than successes, so aim for a lot of setbacks, and you'll get a few successes. That just be patient with yourself, and that's something I'm still learning. But if I could look back, I'm at almost 11 years now since I began this specific journey, and going back to the whiteboard story. So be patient with yourself. Don't beat yourself up. If you're not seeming to keep track, or you have something that just doesn't work out the way you want. And secondly, pray before you write. I know a lot of writers experience writer's block. They experience different challenges of just trying to come up with the right words, trying to figure out a plot hole, trying to figure out there's this thing in history and it doesn't fit the fiction timeline. So what do I do with it? Not that I've ever encountered that, but just pray. And that's, I feel like God's Spirit just comes through me and into the words, not every time, and not that I listen every time, but that's, if you're having those struggles, know that you can take it in prayer. And that's my advice for writers that are launching in there and getting started, and network with other writers as much as you can.
That sounds great. All right, last question, and then we'll go to the comments for whoever is kind of watching, whoever has questions. And I'm sure you always get asked this, but what are you currently working on? You've been trying to take a break, but what's kind of the next project?
Yeah. Oh, I don't take breaks. Let's see, how much time do we have left? So what am I currently working on? I am primarily working on book 4 in the Choctaw Tribune series, which I'm really excited about. There's going to be a little romance in it, which is a little different for the series. And it's actually primarily set in Washington, D.C. So I've been to D.C. twice, done a lot of research and kind of digging of what Choctaws do or did in D.C. during the 1890s. You had the Dawes Commission. And so this is a whole other experience and just exploring what it was like for Choctaws to visit DC and what was there, what was kind of the dynamics, and just the fact of what was in DC at that time. So anyway, that's what I'm working on is book 4. Very excited about that. About almost halfway through it. The first draft. Francine's not on here, but she's one of my big fans of that series. But don't hold your breath. It's going to be a little bit before I get to that. Then I'm also looking at the Irish potato famine, another story I've always wanted to write. So I want a parallel story between the Trail of Tears and the Irish potato famine. I've had that in the back of my mind to do like this dual storyline on that and keep it shorter, more in length of Toshba's story. I've got a action adventure archaeology 1970s kind of story that I'm really excited about. I think it's going to be a multi-part series that I hope to get started on before too long. I've got 6 books in the Choctaw Tribune series, but I'll probably be sneaking in some of that to do. So I'll have 6 books total in the Choctaw Tribune series. And then lastly, I'd like to get into some more warrior stories, some more Choctaw warrior stories, World War II, Korean. And the reason why I know that sounds like a lot, but the way my process works is it can take me years to actually get started on a project. I just collect information. And I know the Choctaw elder who, was the first one on Omaha Beach that I think you guys posted about that and in World War II. And yeah, and I was like, my mom was like, you need to interview him. And I was like, okay, it's on my list. So that could be it could be 5 years down the road, but I'm already collecting material for that book. So that's basically what I'm currently working on in writing.
An impressive array of stuff to kind of work on. But I understand, also I'm writing too, and so it's like I came across these amazing kinds of stories, and I was like, this won't fit in a dissertation. This is another book, and I can, in my head, I have 3 books that I want to write, and so very relatable.
Yes. Well, I hope you do. Let me know if I can help, nudge, or encourage you anyway. That's awesome.
Thank you. So those are kind of all of the questions I have prepared. So if anyone has your questions that you would like to ask Sarah, go ahead and put that in the Q&A, in the chat box, anywhere.
And I want to say thank you, Megan. Those were well thought out questions. I really appreciate that you didn't just ask surface questions, but that you really dug deep into my work and the things that I've done to come up with those questions. That took a lot of effort, and I appreciate that.
course, I was happy to do it. It's like really you learn a lot from. I feel like I know you a lot better because I spent so much time when you're reading or reading your writing. So it's like
Oh,
cool.
thank you. Thank you. I need to update a few things. And I actually on the series, and if you have any questions, I'm just kind of chatting a little bit while we see if anyone has any questions. But the series that I have about my trip to France, I have 3 more posts that are going to be going up sometime. I have them written, I just haven't gotten them up. And so that will complete my series. Where are we at? 2-3 years later on that. But tons of pictures. It was a lot of work trying to sort through those pictures and the memories and make sure that I put the best in there of my adventures there. It was phenomenal.
Sounds
And I can't, on my phone here, I can't see a Q&A, or maybe I can. Oh, Ryan was asking where you got your earrings.
Oh yeah. Instagram.
And that was the first thing I said when we got on the video. I was like, let me see your earrings.
Let's see. Um, do you want to say something maybe about, because you did so much research and archival work, and you actually gave it to the historic preservation department, and do you kind of want to say anything about it? It's very extensive and it's very amazing for you guys who haven't seen it. She even like made a guide. She's like, oh, this is how I explain everything. I was like, whoa, this is amazing. Do you want to kind of comment on that or say anything?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So there is, I call it my database, my Choctaw Code Talker database, and I wanted to put that together. That was actually something I spent last summer on most of the summer putting that together. There's over, I think, 1,000 pieces to it, a lot of primary sources. The reason why I kind of wrote the guide, like you said, is like, wow, is because we take these sources, especially like newspaper articles or books that haven't necessarily been thoroughly vetted, or they were written a long time ago, or whatever the different things, and then other things came out that they were inaccurate. I just didn't want anyone diving into the database and pulling out pieces and writing an article about the Choctaw Code Talkers based on a select few pieces that I wanted to include in the database, but based on primary sources or other sources that we know were inaccurate. So I didn't want people to take an inaccurate newspaper article and say, "Oh, this is the story of the Choctaw Code Talkers." I included the newspaper article because it does talk about the Code Talkers, but this, and this is wrong with it, or kind of be sure and do your research. So I put all that together. I think Jennifer was going to put it on the laserfish technology that you guys have. And it'll be available at the Cultural Center, hopefully, whenever y'all get that together. And it was just good for me to have that, so that if, like, even when you asked me the question about the German propaganda, I was like, I need to go, and I was like, I probably didn't like get that specific, on that in the database, but it's in there somewhere. But I wanted to make it as searchable and as easy for, especially who were going to write a piece about the Choctaw Code Talkers, because I continue, even articles today that I read contain so much inaccurate information about the Choctaw Code Talkers specifically.
Yeah, and
database.
amazing. And I really agree with you because like as a research assistant, we get sent a lot of these kinds of research requests being like, oh, can you tell us kind of about this? And so you pull the primary sources, but when you read them, there is so much inaccuracy. And there's even a lot of like published scholarly work. And it's like, you didn't ask the right person. So your understanding of this is just like completely wrong. And so you really can't take any kind of source at a face value, and you have to really think about the context and kind of all of that. And so I thought I could see that was what you were trying to do. And that's really the work of people who work with archival materials, is like you can't just believe everything that you read. You have to kind of think really carefully about each piece. And so I was really appreciative of that kind of aspect of it.
Absolutely. And drawing the correct conclusions from those pieces, even whenever you read them, if you're not familiar with all of it, there could still be missing things. So you're coming to one conclusion, you have the facts, but you may actually come to the wrong conclusion because you have facts, but you don't have all the facts.
Exactly. Yes.
Fun stuff. Not that I was paranoid about anybody else writing novel. I could have made errors, or there could be things that come out that were unknown, that whenever I wrote my novel, we could have new discoveries. I made new discoveries, which shocked me that I discovered some stuff. I'm like, we don't have this. It's like nobody, as much as this has been researched. And that's why I always tell, other tribes or even Choctaws, keep researching it. There's millions of documents at the National Archives and just spread everywhere in people's boxes in their attic or in their basement or their well house or whatever, that there could be other things that come out of the code talkers, and we may eventually know more of their story than what we have right now.
Yeah, there's like no ending amount of material. It just always shows up. All right, so now we have some questions. So Ryan asks, in your opinion, why is storytelling so important for Choctaw people? What advice do you have on how we can help empower our community in telling stories, both oral and written?
Great question. I believe in the power of storytelling hugely. I think, again, going back to that idea of education through entertainment and just the power of story, it's universal. No matter what culture or country or language, there's power in stories. I mean, even going, looking at the Bible and Jesus and how many stories that he told in parables, that was often how he communicated rather than just giving doctrine or anything like that. So I absolutely believe in the universal power of story. I think there are things that people connect with, like family, like traditions, that regardless of the culture, whenever you share it in that way, people latch onto, because they're like, oh, I can relate to that. I can relate to, you having a grandmother like that who, maybe I'm learning something different about that particular grandmother in that particular culture, but I can relate to the love between a granddaughter and a grandmother. So I believe there's absolutely power in story. And again, going back to that responsibility that I feel I have in telling our stories, in trying to be as historically and culturally accurate as I can, because I know it's going to stick with people. I know that they're going to hear a story or read a story and it could stick with them for the rest of their life. As far as, what was the second part of the question about advice to community? Engaging community and telling stories. I think I know like the Choctaw Foundation is working on recording elder stories. I think one of the big challenge is, elders telling stories. Like some elders, they'll tell you stories. You don't have any problem drawing out stories. And then there are others that it is really challenging to draw out those stories. And I think one of the things we can do as a younger generation is being diligent in listening and being diligent in asking the right questions, because sometimes they're just waiting for that right. Well, one, they're waiting to know if you really care about hearing their story, because probably often, people haven't been interested in hearing their story. But being honest and just really listening whenever they go to share their stories, and then asking the right questions. Miss what was her last name? So it was Captain Horner, who was the captain of the Code Talkers, the Company E, who was not Native, but we got to visit with her. That was her father. So to actually meet someone, of course, all World War I veterans are deceased, but to even meet someone who was the daughter as opposed to the granddaughter or great granddaughter, we actually got to visit with her. And I asked her, did your father share, any war stories? Oh, no, he didn't talk about anything. And so we were probably visiting with her for a couple of hours. We went with Erin Farr from the Sequoia Research Center. She connected with her, and we all sat down and we're talking with her. And we probably went through a couple of hours and just asking questions and just listening to her, what she wanted to share. And by the end of it, she started talking about, like, I wish I still had his uniform, because it had that hole in the shoulder of it where he got shot. It didn't hit him, but it went through his uniform, and they wanted to give him a Purple Heart, but he declined it because he hadn't actually been wounded. And Erin and I just both looked at each other like, that's what we wanted to hear. We wanted to, that's the story that we were trying to get to. We wanted those extra tidbits, anything that was a part of that. So I think in engaging elders with telling stories, and even, I think that's something, like I said, the younger generation can do to bring out those stories. And once they have them, learn them and practice telling them and share them any opportunity you can, at family gatherings, at the Trail of Tears commemorative walk, Labor Day, really, saying, hey, even if it's not your family, so-and-so elder shared with me this story. And, this was, something we didn't know about Wheelock or about Jones or these different places. This was their experience growing up. That's a really good question, because I got Presley Byington. He came up behind me at a Trail of Tears walk because I was talking to someone who was caretakers at Wheelock, and I hear this voice behind me. He's like, "Oh, don't tell her anything. That'll end up in a story sometime." And I turned around. It was Presley. But that's the thing. I guess that's what I do. That's my reputation. Be careful what you tell Sarah, because it'll end up in a story. So that's the main thing, is just encouraging those who are inclined to storytelling and writing to gather those stories and share them in any way and any opportunity they have.
Yeah, and also if you guys have seen the June Itifabasa, we actually have a kind of oral history kind of guide with some questions that you can ask people. And one of the things that I thought was really important is, like, you don't just have to ask elders, like, you just ask your parents. Even your parents know things, kids know things. And so everyone has knowledge, and you can always learn from anyone of any generation as well. So if you haven't, that is kind of in the Biskinik, and so you can grab that there. Okay, and let's see, some more questions. Someone says, Sarah, you mentioned the Irish potato famine of the 1940s, 1950s. Are you familiar with the Scottish Highland clearances after 1745? He says, after the Third Scottish Rebellion, with the English army attacked the Highland clans and slaughtered the cattle, they turned the land over, burned the farms, and drove people out. And there's kind of similar themes between Irish and Scottish campaigns to ban the Celtic language and identity, and kind of all that. It's very familiar themes. Do you know anything about that?
Absolutely, I do know. So I'm not real familiar with that. But going back to Roger, who was our tour guide in France, he was Scotch, Welsh, and British. So he wrote an endorsement for a Numpa Warrior, and he actually brings out, I'm not even sure if it's the same time period, but he does bring out a comparison between, at least with the Welsh, so not Scots, I guess, but he does bring out a comparison with the Welsh and the suppression of language, and how that compared to, he really grasped onto that with the novel. So I think one of the things, going back to universal themes of things like that happening, these stories can bring healing. And I think people like that, of the different cultures and stuff, when they read a story like this and they see it being told, it can bring an element to healing. But I'm not 100% sure, like, that specific. I'll go back and read the comment on that history. But thank you for sharing that, because there are a lot of similarities throughout world cultures on stories like that.
And then one last question says, what sparked your interest in writing?
I do have a story on that. I was about 5, and I had a story I wanted to tell about kindness, about people being kind to one another. But I was horribly shy. Whenever I was growing up, when someone would ring the doorbell, I would run hide behind my mama's skirt. So I was very shy. So I had that story, and I really had a burning desire to tell it, or for people to get that message. And I knew I wouldn't be able to verbally tell it because of my shyness. So I wrote it. And that, I think, was really the beginning, and what I latched onto as a writer, and probably one of the reasons why I still enjoy writing over public speaking. I do enjoy public speaking and storytelling orally to a degree, but that was a big part of my inspiration for being a writer, is having messages to share and wanting to do it, and doing it in written form. Yeah.
Very nice.
Good question.
Yes. Let's see. Patrick wanted to mention that he has copies of his books that he's going to send to relatives in Ireland.
Oh, that's awesome, Patrick. Thank you. I hope they appreciate. I know they'll appreciate you thinking of them like that. But I hope they enjoy the books. That's exciting.
It'll be great for them to learn a little bit more about Choctaws.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of all the questions that we have. Do you have any questions for me or anything kind of else? Anyone, this is your last chance before we close.
Yeah. Any other questions? This has been great, Meg. Love it. Shout out to everybody that's taken their lunch hour to join us on this and hear a little bit about these books and what we're trying to do with them. So I really appreciate that.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's kind of all that we have for today. And so in 2 weeks, we will be having Scott Ketchum and Holly Jones, who both work at East Central University, who've been involved with various kinds of efforts at the university, doing kinds of stuff for Native students. And so they're going to kind of share what they're working on and how they're kind of helping Indian communities in that kind of way. And that's going to be with Deanna Bird, who's also in our department. So join us next time and let us all give a great thank you to Sarah Sawyer for all of her time today. Thank you so much for everything.
Absolutely. Yakoki, thank you for having me. Enjoyed this.
Yes. Awesome. All right. Peace, everyone.
May. Bye-bye.